And so I'm going to call the meeting to order. We have on our agenda today only one item, and that is some time-sensitive issues related to the COVID relief. And under those circumstances, I would ask for a motion to approve the agenda as presented. Dina, I see Dina's hand. Anybody else who seconds the motion? Ann seconds the motion. So the motion, all in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Opposed? I see 8-0, Peggy. At this time, we have both Randy and Brad with us. And so Randy, I'll turn it over to you and you proceed with the explanation as you see fit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just noticed, even though we did meet early this morning, that Brad and I look like we're similarly attired. So we must have called each other to get the agency uniform going forward. This normally would be in your consent agenda in March. Their contracts, administrative contracts to do ESSER 2 and EANS money. I'll go through them in detail, but we need to get started on this work before you meet in March, as things are moving very fast. The federal government wants us to get this money out in a very timely manner. And so we bring to you parts of 3 contracts that would be the possibility of one motion. So let me walk you through the 3 different parts of this that we're asking for approval on today, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions. As you know, that when the pandemic started in mid-March, we started to close buildings, the U.S. Department of Ed started to award the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. We call that ESSER. And they started to award in December the Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools, or EANS. Those funds are intended to help school districts open safely and measure and effectively address learning loss and take other actions to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on students and families. So in looking at what we did well and what we could do better, the first contract will be with United School Administrators of Kansas. This is the umbrella organization that has all special ed directors and principals, elementary and secondary, assistant
Randy,
superintendent.
let me interrupt just a second. I got a note here that Ben and Michelle are both trying to check in. Let's give it, and I see them coming. And so, yeah, now we're all here. So let's go ahead and continue the explanation.
Okay, I was just getting started, Ben and Michelle. I apologize. But what we have in front of you would have been in consent in March, but we need to speed this up. So there's 3 contracts because we're going to have a task force meeting on Friday, and this process will start very promptly. So as I was mentioning, as you guys were coming in, there are 2 pots of money sent to us from the U.S. Department of Ed. The first is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief, ESSER Fund, and the second is the Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools, or EANS money. So what the task force will be looking at starting on Friday will be the distribution of those 2 funds. The contracts in front of you are for some of the administrative work that needs to happen related to ESSER 2 and EANS funding. So the first is United School Administrators. This is the umbrella group that oversees elementary and secondary principals, superintendents, assistant superintendents, special ed directors, and a handful of smaller organizations such as the communications people. They then in turn will work with the Kansas Association of School Boards and the Kelly Leadership Institute to train all principals, all superintendents, assistant superintendents, special ed directors, and school boards in how to effectively plan for the distribution of ESSER II funds, primarily how to spend this in a robust way in summer school and extended school year and in tutoring, doing so in a manner that is consistent with navigating change and Kansans can. What we found in navigating change, while we got that out early enough, many school districts didn't implement it to the depth that we wanted because they lacked the training to do so. This provides over 2 years the training to do that. And so the 700,000 would be between those three groups. Just let me give you an example. Kelly, Kansas Education Leadership Institute, would train then new principals, new superintendents. USA would do the bulk of the group. The Kansas Association of School Boards would do school boards. So this would start as early as March 1 of 2021 and would go through June 30th of 2023, or approximately a year and a few months. Chairman, if you want, I can go through them all and then answer questions, or I can pause and answer questions in between.
Let's go ahead and go through all of them, and then we'll have questions.
Okay. The second is to help stand up the amount of money that we're going to be taking to the task force and telling the story of what this money needs to be spent for, to give a very detailed behind the scenes look at the money, and then to be able to give reports about how that money was effectively used for the pandemic. So we propose using the Boston Consulting Group. This group has already received an umbrella contract with the State Office of Recovery. That was passed by the bipartisan State Finance Council, as many of you know. It was passed by them. And so they were able to stand contracts up under that umbrella. They will be directly aiding us in the oversight, the allocation, the reporting, the spending, the application process of the ESSER II funding and ENS funding, specifically with the task force that will be started on Monday. Their work would then start as early as tomorrow, go for 5 weeks, not to exceed 600,000. By the way, all of these are not to exceed, meaning we don't ship the entire amount of money to them. They bill us for the appropriate services, and then that contract's not to exceed. So I need to make sure that you understand that. And the third and the most complicated of all of these is the ENS money that's going to private schools. So this is, in the past, the way that private schools received money from the federal government was through the Title I formula. That went to a school district, let's say Goddard. Goddard then distributed to the private schools within the Goddard School District. That's the way that's always operated since 1965. In December, the federal government changed the distribution and established an ENS type distribution. It didn't do so in ESSER I, and if there is an ESSER III, we think ESSER I and ESSER III will go to the school districts. But in this case, it came directly to the governor, which then by law moved to us in order to distribute $26.667 million. That's what's available. So the service centers of Kansas have agreed to administer the services and the contracts that the private schools may apply to. And I said this is complicated because private schools cannot directly receive federal money. It has to be drawn down in this form of services. So let's say, for example, that the Salina Diocese said, we'd like to have some portable HEPA filtration units to put in our classroom. That's allowable expense, but the state of Kansas owns those units. And at the end of the contract, which would be September of 23, they become part of the state. Now they can get staff development services, they can get a variety of services, but that money cannot go directly to them like it does the public schools. So in this case, the service centers, on behalf of the private school systems, would have access to almost $27 million, not to send them the money. They would draw that down to provide the services that, for example, the Lutheran schools would want to do. So how do we know what the Lutheran schools want to do? Or how do we know what the Kansas City Diocese schools want to do? They will make application, just like the public schools, to the task force. Once the task force approves what they've asked for, then that money would get distributed to the service center that the private schools have asked to use, and they would deliver those services not to exceed a 4% administrative cost to do so. So it says not to exceed 26.667 million, but we're not sending that out. Betty, they would have to apply, if you would, for that money. So the private schools have access to ask for up to almost $27 million. Any money that they don't request and is not approved by the task force, then eventually goes back to the governor to be reallocated under the law as it relates to other priorities in GEAR funding mechanisms. The speed of which that's going to go out is probably, again, something we haven't seen. We believe that the state of Kansas, if they don't have that money already, will have it maybe today. We have 30 days to get an application process out, and the private schools have 30 days to request that money. So if you just look at that timeline, by the end of April, all of this has to transpire. And that's why, if you look at these three contracts today, we have to get going on this, and why Jim and Janet asked for a special meeting. We don't like to do special meetings. It's the speed of which this is occurring. And just before I pause and see if there's any questions, as we speak, ESSER 3 money is traveling through the House of Representatives, and we believe by the end of the week, we'll have passed out of the House of Representatives and will go to the Senate for possible approval. And so we may be also getting another chunk of money that we would also then be bringing you back more administrative contracts to oversee those dollars. So this is very unusual because of how the federal government's distributing the money this time and the amount of money. Those are the two unusual things. Otherwise, the Title I formula has been used ever since it was put into place in 1965. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to try to answer questions, and Brad's here if we need additional help.
Okay, are there questions? Ann.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple. Randy, the training for that USA and KASB and Kelly's going to do, why does that take 2 years? I mean, would they still be training the summer of 23?
Yes, because we're talking about move to competencies and move to a different style. Brad, would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so the goal, Ann, would be they're going to hire additional staff, mentors, trainers over the next 2 years, because while there's a lot of planning just for this summer, we really believe that the level of trainings that our school administrators are going to need is going to take a couple years. just to make it significant, go to the depth of training and supports that we believe they need. So we wanted to spread it out since we have 2 years. And the USA money is coming out of our administrative part. So we want to use that over the next 2 years to try to make deeper impact on the trainings, because we think for especially 5 of our counties, supports related to COVID are going to last for the next several, a year to 2. Before school, after school next year, the following summer. So that's why we wanted to spread it out over 2 years.
Okay, and then,
Might also add, Ann,
Mhm.
if you, for all of us to remember, the learning loss that we are seeing in mathematics, which is a little bit larger than literacy, and the social emotional loss, we have 2 years to try to mitigate that loss. Now, the class of 21, we don't have much time, but this money doesn't need to be spent until after the summer of 2023. So all of this is what we're looking at. I apologize, Ann. Go ahead.
that's okay, and I assume it will include all the training would be for all public and private schools?
Yes.
Okay, the only other question was the private schools, if the money's not being distributed on Title I basis, is it kind of first come, first served? If I get my request in first, I get the money? Or how do we make sure that smaller districts that might not be, private schools that might not be up on this get their fair share?
Good question, Ann. And let me just also remind everyone, this is for private accredited and private non-accredited schools. So any private school can apply. They're going to have a 30-day window, and the task force will have to prioritize that, Ann. But we've already had one Zoom, and I think our staff had another call with the private. We don't know who the non-accredited private are. We don't keep that information. So we've tried to give that out, but it'll try to be distributed as they apply for that money within 30 days of the application.
Oh, so within 30 days of the time they apply, we have to deal with it, approve it or not approve it?
That's right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Certainly. Betty? We're not hearing you, Betty. Betty, we're not hearing you.
Okay, thank you and good morning. If you could clear up one thing, because on private schools, the examples you gave were for tangible items. So I'm a little confused. If they're trying to mitigate learning loss through expanding summer schools or whatever, are they eligible, private schools, for that?
Yes, they are, Betty. And let me back up and say part of the application process for private schools, as it is for public, as you know, in public, the more poverty you have, the more funds you get. In private, a priority on poverty has to be a part of their application. So going back to Ann's comments, if you're in a private system, let's say Bishop Ward, for example, in Kansas City, they have a fair amount of poverty in that school. So they would have higher priority over someone that doesn't have any. But Betty, they could run summer school. But the money can't go directly to the school. So they would contract, and I'm using this as an example, Smoky Hill Service Center would then contract for the appropriate rate of whatever, let's say Pittsburgh Colgan says, this is how much we want to pay teachers. This is how long we want to run summer school. Smoky Hill Service Center then would contract and be the employer, if you would, to send that money to Pittsburgh Colgan in this example. And then they would send those teachers 1099s because they couldn't be employed directly by the diocese. Does that help?
Are there other questions? Jim?
Thank you, Mr. Porter. Randy, can you address the issues of accountability? There's a rush to get the money out right now, but at the same time, what are the accountability aspects that we're going to be looking at later on? Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. And so we know that when this money is done, there will be federal audits that start to happen in the fall of 2023, probably extending into 2025. To be ready for that, the task force, obviously, Jim, first oversight is to approve the expenditures or the application per law, per exactly the law. The second is to make sure that money was spent in accordance to the application. So what the task force will do starting in the summer of 22 is start to take a look at how this money was spent. And the Boston Consulting Group will be doing a lot of this work for us and drawing the reports for making sure the money was spent. Go back to my example. Pittsburgh Colgan wants to run summer school. And they said it's going to take us, it's going to take us $78,000, and here's how much we're going to pay teachers and paras. We're going to run it for 6 weeks. We'll then ask for a report back on the money that went out on that summer school. That'll happen next summer. And then when we close the books in the summer of 23, the task force will get detailed reports on how every bit of this money was spent on the public and the private school side.
Well, that's accountability for the dollars that are spent, but what about the accountability for bringing kids back or improving their where they are?
Well, that's probably more of the state board than it is the task force, Jim. The task force is charged with the oversight of the money. I think the state board has already said schools should be in session as long as they're doing things safely. And of course, we want to do things a little differently in the learning process to engage families. So I think that would be a state board oversight in the future.
So that's a future agenda item for us to see if the money was spent and kids did in fact receive benefits and improve.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's our job. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions. Oh, Dina.
So talking about it, accountability and this whole process, receiving as a board updates on kind of a summary of what's occurred during the time, or is this all going to be kept within the task force itself?
Excellent question, Dina. After every task force meeting on the Friday notes, the following Friday notes, you'll get a report from them. At your board meeting, you will get everything that's approved and the reports that the task force saw for your benefit. So everything will come to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Certainly.
One-
Janet, did you have your hand up? Oh, Brad, did you have a comment?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add to this, to make sure it's important, that with all this money, we don't just send it to them, whether it's the private school money with the service center, they don't get all the money. They have to draw down as expenses occur to reimburse whatever they've been providing to the private schools. So our internal team will be able to monitor what they're drawing down and for what purposes. So they don't just get the money, the money's available, but they draw it down to reimburse whatever, whether it's professional development, whether it's paying for summer school. So we'll be able to monitor as they draw the funds down. Just like with school districts with their money, we get to see what they're drawing it down for. We don't just give them the money. It's only when they need it.
And as approved by the task force.
Thank you.
One of my other questions was kind of the overall, and maybe you've answered it with what you just told me or told us, but ultimately, which body ultimately is responsible if something isn't spent correctly? And because the federal government has a way of clawing back money if, as I recall, when I was in the legislature anyway, that occurred on occasion. So what is it, the department, or is it the state board that's ultimately responsible?
Thank you, Dina. The law hasn't changed, so the money goes to the agency, and the agency is responsible for the distribution. What has changed is the amount of money and the political nature of looking at this money and the speed of which the money has to go out. Those are the three things that have changed over past practices, but the law holds the agency accountable for the distributions and the auditing of the funds. We're putting the task force in place, and we're also putting the oversight of the state board, as Jim mentioned, on the learning outcomes, in addition to what the law requires.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that this task force is not a requirement. It's something that has been put together by us for the purpose of trying to assure that the money is spent appropriately. It's just another set of safeguards that's not requiring kind of an abundance of caution to make sure that that there is direct oversight, not only to protect us and our responsibility, but to protect school districts for not spending the money incorrectly and then having it, as Dina said, clawed back. Janet, I believe I saw your hand at one time.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just curious if you would like a motion.
That would be fine.
Okay, I move that the Kansas State Board of Education authorize the Commissioner of Education to negotiate and enter into contract with the United School Administrators of Kansas, the Boston Consulting Group, and the Kansas Association of Educational Service Agencies for the purpose of administrative oversight of ESSER II and EANS federal COVID relief funds in the amounts and contract period specified.
Thank you. Is there a second to that motion? Melanie seconds the motion. Is there any further discussion? Ann?
Was there a dollar amount in that motion?
There is in the, it says the amount specified, and the amount specified in our work here. But we can add that. What's the advice of the commissioner, deputy commissioner, attorney?
It's in the materials that you received, so it's in the amount as specified and what we just discussed.
Which would be for United School Administrators, that group 700,000, for the Boston Consulting Group not to exceed 600,000, and for the Kansas Association of Educational Service Centers, the amount that's available to public schools, which is $26,667,139. And by saying as specified, I assume it appears to me that that is covered in the motion.
Okay, so that document would be an attachment to the motion then?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Motion is made and seconded. Is there any other questions? If not, all in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All opposed to the motion? Abstain? 9-0-1. Thank you. Since special meetings can only cover what is specifically mentioned in the call of that meeting, we have completed our responsibilities for today and can have no further action. So in that case, I thank you all for participating, and we are adjourned.